In the next few minutes, I want to talk about the text of the Bible, and by that I mean the situation is this. We do not have the original copies of any biblical book from Genesis to Revelation. Now that can be surprising to a person when they first hear it, that what we have are actually copies of copies of copies. In the case of the Old Testament, the oldest copies of the Old Testament we have date to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, the Dead Sea Scrolls date to about 100 BC. Well, when did Isaiah live? Isaiah lived around 700 BC. Moses lived 13, 14, 1500 BC. And so the oldest copies we have of the Old Testament date hundreds of years after those books were actually first written. Same situation with the New Testament. The oldest Greek manuscripts we have, the most, for example, the oldest pretty much substantial manuscript of Paul's writings dates to about 200 AD, or AD 200. Now that's 150 years after Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. So sometimes people are shocked to find how many centuries after these books were actually first written are the surviving copies. Now, this is not something that we should be alarmed about. We're actually in a much better situation when it comes to the books of the Bible than we are, for example, with regard to the books of Plato or some of the other ancient Greeks. Nobody goes around worrying about what Virgil or Homer originally said. There are scholars who talk about those things, but when you took a philosophy class, if you ever took a philosophy class, the substantial teachings of Plato are not in question, even though the manuscripts we only have just maybe a half a dozen in some good situations, manuscripts of certain Plato's writings. We have over 5,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. Now, most of them are medieval, which means that most of them date from around AD 1000 and are 1,000 years after Paul actually wrote. But we do have some very old ones. For example, to have a very, very, very substantial manuscript of Paul's writings that dates from about AD 200, that is really exceptional when it comes to the question of ancient manuscripts. And so even though a person might be shocked to know that we don't have the original copy of Romans with Paul's signature right there at the end for anyone to look at, even though we don't have that, we are really in a much better situation when it comes to having ancient copies than we are in relation to many, many other ancient writings. So we're actually not in a bad case. But what happens is each of these manuscripts is going to have minor differences from each other. None of them is going to be exactly the same, because when people copied things, they made errors. Now, most of the time, I'm going to make up a number. I don't know what the precise number is, but let's say that 95 or 93, who knows, somewhere, a very high percentage of the time, the copies are so close to each other, or the mistake in copying is so obvious that there's really no question. In the over 90%, well over 90% of the various copies of the Old and New Testament that we have, well over 90% of the time, we're pretty clear what the original actually said. And in that remaining, say, 5% of the time, the difference are nothing, no essential doctrine is called into question because of manuscript variations. That is to say, if the oldest manuscripts of Colossians leave out the phrase through his blood in one verse, then there is a place in Ephesians, frankly there's a place a couple verses later where the blood of Christ is mentioned as well. So there's no conspiracy. You sometimes hear about conspiracies to take out the blood of Christ. Well, if that was a conspiracy, it was a very bad conspiracy because it's still there in plenty of places. There's no conspiracy about manuscripts, no matter what you sometimes hear on the popular level. You simply have people copying manuscripts and sometimes making mistakes. And of course, there were some intentional kinds of changes that people made, but I'm convinced that even in those cases, the intention was good. In other words, most of those changes would have been to clarify the biblical text rather than to mess things up or to take some doctrine out. It's all there, even in the manuscripts that would be missing the most, if you would. Every essential Christian thought or idea is there somewhere else. So, the field of textual criticism asks, how did the original text read? Now, the word criticism can be off-putting because when we think of criticizing, we often think of, man, you're going to wear that dress out in public? That's what we think of when we think of criticism. That's not what criticism means in this context, and this is the only place I'm going to call it textual criticism. But criticism in this context means critical thinking, making sound, objective decisions. So that's the situation with regard to the text in a nutshell. Let me talk for a second about the King James Version, because in some circles the King James Version remains the version. Now, in most churches, this is a debate of 40, 50 years ago. Well, more like 40, 30 or 40 years ago. Most churches don't have an issue with what version you use. Most churches would say use whatever version you think you hear God's voice most clearly in. Well, I don't know whether most would say that, but I would say most healthy churches have that view. Use the version of the Bible that through which you hear God's voice the most. And if that's the King James or the New King James, that's great. If it's something else, that's great. I mean, you do hear people who are anti the Message or anti the TNIV, or you do find a lot of that kind of version warfare, and some of that has to do with the philosophy of translation more than it has to do with the question of the text. That's a different subject. How do you translate? Do you translate very woodenly, or do you translate very freely? That's a different issue, and one that will be covered elsewhere. This particular vidcast is about how did the original text read? What were the words that were there, and what were the words that weren't there? Of the variations among manuscripts, how did the original read? And here we basically only have two alternatives. There are two alternatives. To start off with, I'm going to call the old alternative the King James alternative. This is the textual tradition that has the ending of Mark, for example, Mark 16, 9 through 20. It's a longer version. It has more verses, more words, not a whole lot more. I mean, like I said, 90+% is the same. But you have this one textual tradition that I'm going to call right now the King James tradition. And then the other one is everybody else. That is all the pretty much modern versions of the Bible. Not all. The Broadman-Holman Bible, it's not too old. It has a tendency to follow this tradition a little bit more. But basically, you only have two choices when it comes to this question of how you think the original manuscripts of the Bible read. And once you've made your decision as to which you buy into, even then you're once again you're pretty clear about what the original text read, depending on which choice you make. If you go with the King James tradition, then you're pretty sure you know pretty much what the text read. If you go with the majority of modern translations, then you pretty much know what the original text read. But I want to, in this vidcast, explain what the issues are in making that choice. Now, the King James Version came out in 1611. If you're listening to this vidcast in 2011, this is the 400th anniversary of the King James Version. Of course, the King James Version that you would typically buy in a Christian bookstore is not the 1611 version. It was updated over the 150 years or so after the first King James came out. It was edited as many as 5 times. Not all of those were massive revisions, but the King James Version that you would buy in a bookstore today is not the 1611 version. So we want to make it very clear that the King James Version was never intended to be set in stone for all eternity. Over the first 200 years of its existence, there was an understanding that language changes, that things need to be updated. And so those who insist, no, we must use the original King James Version even in English, and we cannot use even the New King James Version. There are individuals who would say even the New King James Version shouldn't be used. That whole view reflects, just to be honest, a pretty significant ignorance of how language functions. Language changes. I mean, the word Google didn't exist in the English language 15 years ago, if you're listening to this in 2011. Language changes, meaning change. Language doesn't mean the same. There are things in the King James Version that its readers probably think they understand, but don't, because the word doesn't mean the same thing. When the King James Version says, let your conversation be known, it's not talking about speaking like I'm doing now. Conversation in, I think, 1789 or whenever the last King James revision was done, conversation meant manner of conduct. And so it's very easy to suppose that there are many King James Version users who think they understand what that verse means when they don't even understand the English, because the English has changed meaning. Language has to be updated for it to be understood. And eventually, of course, language changes to where you can't even understand the way people spoke before. Shakespearean English is very difficult for me to understand without some notes to explain. If you've ever read Beowulf, Beowulf is in English, but man, it's not an English that I speak. Language changes. This is the nature of things. And so it has to be updated if people are going to understand it. Either that or eventually you'll have to take a language class just to be able to understand the King James Version. We're at that now in terms of the everyday person on the street. They're not going to understand the King James for what it meant originally. So let's get that just out of the way there. But the King James Version was not the first English version by any means. In fact, it was a compromise translation between the Geneva Bible, which was actually the Bible of the Puritans, the Bible that was most popular among the English at the time, at least the English Puritans, and then the Bishop's Bible. The Bishop's Bible was resented by the Puritans because it had notes. Both of these Bibles had notes, as I recall. The Geneva Bible had notes that were perceived to be against the king, anti-monarchist notes. The Bishop's Bible had notes that were perceived to be not to take the biblical text with enough authority, and so King James, who was himself probably no particularly righteous man, of course he didn't translate it; he just commissioned it. But King James commissioned this compromise translation, and it didn't catch on immediately. In fact, if I remember correctly, the Puritans who first came to America in the 1600s brought the Geneva Bible, not the King James Bible so much, to America. But the King James Version did catch on and did become the primary, the English version. The King James Version of 1611 was based on the so-called Textus Receptus of Stephanus, which dated to 1550. Textus Receptus means received text. The Greek, in other words, the Greek text that for the New Testament that had come to be accepted as the as the text of the New Testament. And of course that ultimately came from a Roman Catholic by the name of Erasmus in the days before the Reformation. And Erasmus, of course, remained Roman Catholic after the Protestant Reformation. He was a humanist who argued against Martin Luther. Although he was friends with Martin Luther, he argued against Martin Luther when Luther began to protest and withdraw. And so it is somewhat ironic in the sense that those who are most strongly in favor of the King James are also usually very anti-Catholic. And so it is interesting that the fountainhead of the Greek text behind the King James Version was somebody who opposed the Protestant Reformation, although he was a more of a liberal than a dyed-in-the-wool Roman Catholic papist, so to speak. But more about the King James. Erasmus, when he in the late 1400s, he only had about 12 Greek manuscripts to assemble the New Testament, Greek New Testament from. The oldest copies he had were from the 900s. And it's, again, significant to realize that the manuscripts that modern scholars now use to reconstruct the original text, how it worded, are as old as 700 years older than what Erasmus. Sometimes, I know when I first read the NIV, for example, I was a little annoyed by, for example, in Mark 16, you come across a note that says something like the oldest and most reliable manuscripts don't have these verses. That's a little annoying, especially if you've grown up reading Mark 16, 9 through 20. But you have to realize that the manuscripts on which the NIV is based is 700, 800, 900 years older. So it defies our common sense. To us, the King James seems old and the NIV seems new. But in terms of the manuscripts, a manuscript is a handwritten copy. This is in other words, pre-printing press. In terms of the manuscripts, the NIV tradition is about 1,000 years older than the manuscripts behind the King James. So even though the King James is old and the NIV is new, in terms of the copies of the New Testament they're based on, the NIV is much older. And so what modern scholars would say is not that the NIV took words out. That's what you hear sometimes. But that, in fact, the King James reflects words that were added in over time. Well, again, you have to make up your decision on these things. Erasmus, I like Erasmus. Erasmus was an entrepreneur, and you've heard of the Gutenberg Bible, but the Gutenberg Bible was in Latin. There was no, at that time, in the late 1400s, there was no Greek printing press version of the New Testament. And there were some scholars in Spain who were working on a very scholarly parallel Bible, including the Greek New Testament. But Erasmus and a friend thought that they could beat them, that they could be the first. I like this about Erasmus. It reminds me of Wesley Seminary and Indiana Wesleyan University. Erasmus began to scramble to put a copy together, and he did, in fact, win. But again, it's important to realize that he had about a dozen manuscripts. He used 6 especially, but the oldest one was from the 900s. He didn't actually use that one as much as the ones that were medieval even later. We now have manuscripts from the 200s, the 300s, the 400s. We have 2 nearly complete copies of the New Testament from the early 300s. They're called codex. A codex is a book. Codex Sinaiticus, which was discovered in the around Mount Sinai, and Codex Vaticanus, which was discovered in the Vatican. Both these were discovered in the 1800s. There's some, if you like Indiana Jones, the Indiana Jones of manuscripts was a guy named Tischendorf, who went around finding these things in the 1800s. Again, those who oppose modern translations sometimes villainize Codex Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, but it's important to realize that since that point in the 1800s, we've discovered older manuscripts than them, and so you can't malign Sinaiticus and Vaticanus and undermine modern translations anymore, because we've discovered older ones, and guess what? The older ones pretty much agree with Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. So again, you get all kinds of coping mechanisms with these new realities. You get individuals maligning the character of B.F. Westcott and Hort, who were two individuals who put together the method that I'm presenting of how most scholars would go about deciding how the original text read. But you can't get, I mean, just because you assassinate the character of Westcott and Hort or assassinate the reliability of Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because that Westcott and Hort really only systematized their presentation. The ideas that Westcott and Hort put in their famous book on the science of textual criticism, the methods that they set down, they didn't come up with. They'd been recognized by scholars of this area for well over a century before them. Also, the manuscripts that they used, we found older manuscripts that basically agree. And so, let me just say, make a claim. You're welcome to disagree, and certainly I could be wrong. But from a standpoint of objectivity, I do not see how anybody whose primary interest is in the truth, rather than reinforcing an idea you're comfortable with, I do not see how anybody who's approaching the evidence objectively can conclude that that the King James tradition is more likely to be the original tradition. I didn't always think that way. I started off resistant to modern translations. It was only by just finally having to admit to myself that the evidence was against me that I eventually changed my mind. Again, everyone is welcome to, everyone has to take their own path. And there are blind spots for generations. So you'll have to think through the issue yourself and make your own decisions. Now, Erasmus, being such an entrepreneur, at times he translated back to Greek from Latin. So he did not have a complete copy of Revelation when he did his initial translation. And so at Revelation 22:14, I think it says something in the King James about the works of the righteous, whereas other versions say something about washing the robes. There are Greek manuscripts that have washing the robes. I believe I can't remember which is which. I think the works is the King James and the robes is the modern translations. There are Greek manuscripts that have both readings. Whether or not Erasmus would have ended with works, or whether he would have gone with robes if he'd have had a complete copy of Revelation, I don't know. However, it is interesting that after his first edition came out, he did eventually secure a copy of Revelation. But his initial version had some Greek readings that weren't in any manuscripts because he just freely translated back from Latin, which is kind of interesting. But this verse probably it remains the way it does because of that situation, because the Latin version he had works. But I really do admire Erasmus. He got the job done. People like Erasmus get the job done, while the more pedantic scholars, and there's a place for pedantic scholars, I'm not saying that, but the more pedantic scholars have a tendency not to get things done. Now, Catholic politics may have gotten in 1 John 5:7. 1 John 5:7 is the most explicitly Trinitarian verse in the whole New Testament. The problem is it doesn't appear in any Greek manuscripts before about 1500, when Erasmus himself was compiling the Greek New Testament. It does appear in the margins of a few older manuscripts, but in a later hand, as I understand the situation. And of course, this verse, this most Trinitarian verse in the whole New Testament, is never mentioned in the entirety of the Trinitarian debates of the early centuries. Now, to me, that means there's just not any chance at all that this is original. There's no chance because in the Trinitarian debates of the 300s, they would have mentioned the most Trinitarian verse in the Bible. This is clearly a verse there's nothing wrong with the verse. And that's another important thing to say. When we're asking how did the original text read, what was its wording, we're not asking which reading has the best theology. King James has great theology. In fact, maybe we should use it for its theology. We just shouldn't use it if our goal is to have the most original text. This is an interesting thing to ponder, that actually the King James might be a better theological text from a Christian standpoint, regardless of the fact that it is not likely to be the most original text. That's something you might want to think about. But the story goes that Erasmus was not going to put this Trinitarian verse in his Greek New Testament. In fact, I don't think it was in his first edition, but that he was pressured by a Roman Catholic bishop or some person of some authority to put it in, because after all, it's a great verse on the Trinity. And so Erasmus, so the story goes, claimed that he would put it in if they could show him one Greek manuscript that had it in it. And in his journal, he notes that the ink seemed to still be wet when they presented him with one. Now, again, there's nothing wrong with 1 John 1:7. The question is strictly, was it in the first copy of 1 John? And that does not at all seem likely. So, what is the method of modern textual criticism? How does it work? It basically works on two principles. First of all, what is the external evidence of the manuscript? What this means is, what is the lay of the land when it comes to the actual copies we have? And here, the rule for modern versions is, how do the oldest and most reliable manuscripts read? Now, oldest is determined on the basis of paleography. That is, we compare various texts written at the same time, and we there are people, these are the pedantic scholars we love to have somewhere in a back room doing their work. But paleography basically takes handwriting style, because styles change. Have you ever seen got out a Bible from your great-grandmother? There was a certain style that you can tell, I can tell that that dates from the 1930s. That's the way people used to write. That's the way they learned to write in school. Or that's the way they spelled words. So oldest is, there's a science of dating manuscripts by their writing. Of course, there are also scientific methods for dating. Carbon-14 dated the Shroud of Turin to the 1400s, which pretty much settles the question on whether or not it's the original shroud. So you can also take a small sample of a manuscript and date the paper. So oldest is okay. Reliable is a little bit circular. Well, how do you know what the most reliable manuscripts are? Someone might argue that the reason why the oldest manuscripts tend to read more like modern versions is because they were bad manuscripts and nobody used them, and that all the manuscripts that people used actually turned out to be to wear out, so that the oldest manuscripts we have are not the most reliable. But one of the things that Westcott and Hort, I think, showed is that there is a kind of pattern we see among manuscripts. For example, you might have one old manuscript that says A, and another old manuscript that says B, and then you might have a medieval manuscript that says A and B. And they used just common sense. They said, well, what's the best explanation for this? Well, some copyist had two manuscripts in front of him, one of which said A and one of which said B, and he didn't want to lose either of them, so he put them both in. The idea of what the most reliable manuscripts are actually derives from patterns in what we call internal evidence. And I was never convinced of what I'm saying on the basis of external evidence. I was finally convinced of these methods because of internal evidence. This just makes so much common sense. Internal evidence does. I'll talk about it in a second. That I think it's compelling, and I would have just had to turn my brain off not to accept it. But internal evidence basically asks this common sense question: which original reading would best explain how the other variants arose? That's just common sense. It's like a detective puzzle. Which came first and what happened next? And the most reliable manuscripts, that kind of most reliable status, is something that has derived over time from experts in this area, and I'm not an expert in this area, but from experts, pedantic experts in this area, who have looked at patterns of internal evidence in order to say, well, this family of manuscripts seems to be a pretty reliable family because the internal evidence consistently comes out the best. So now that's an overview, but let me go into some of the specifics. First, of external evidence. For the Old Testament, and I'm sorry I've been talking mostly about the New Testament, all the debates happened in the New Testament. By the time the Dead Sea Scrolls came around, the debates over textual criticism had pretty much already been won. The Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in the late 1940s, and by that time, for example, my church has a statement in its documents that the Bible's authority has to do with the original manuscripts, and so the original manuscripts part basically says that we're allowed to do textual criticism. So the reason why there's not as much of a fuss over the Old Testament text is because, one, we don't have as many manuscripts, and two, by the time the Dead Sea Scrolls came along, pretty much this debate had been won in mainstream evangelical circles. Evangelicalism has never had a problem with textual criticism. In fact, the evangelicals invented a distinction between what they called higher criticism and what they called lower criticism. This is, of course, just I don't know whether it's an artificial distinction, but basically the idea is that lower criticism was okay, higher criticism was not. So textual criticism being lower criticism was okay. That debate was pretty much won by the time the Dead Sea Scrolls came along. But there are a few places where the Dead Sea Scrolls have changed our sense of the original. For example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, 1 Samuel 10:27 has a whole paragraph that is very helpful, actually, in understanding the train of thought, but that's not there in any of the Hebrew manuscripts we had of the Old Testament before the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, interestingly enough, most modern translations have still not put it in. The only one I know to put it in so far is the New Revised Standard Version. So if you want to see that extra paragraph, check out the NRSV of 1 Samuel 10:27. But there are other places where, for example, the Greek translation of the Old Testament said one thing, and the Hebrew texts we have before the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest Old Testament texts we had were the Masoretic texts, which also dated from the medieval period. So you're talking, 1,500 years and more between when the Old Testament was written and the Masoretic text. But the Dead Sea Scrolls brought us back 1,000 years in how old the manuscripts we had. Now, a couple things let me say, they don't really go here, but before I forget, let me say, for example, that there's a rule in manuscripts that manuscripts are to be weighed, not counted. As you'll see at the end, there are some who say they should be counted. But the principle that manuscripts should be weighed, not counted, basically takes into account the fact that if you have person 1 and person 2, person 1 says, I think she said this, and person 2 says, I think she said this. Well, let's say person 1 convinces 10 people that he heard her correctly, and person 2 convinces 100 people that he heard her correctly. Now, by the time you end up with all those people, you have 11 people saying she said one thing, and 101 people saying she said another thing. But really, if you go back to the sources, it's a one-on-one thing. It's a 50-50 chance. She either said what person 1 said or what person 2 said. So if you count all the people they convinced, that's really not clearly relevant to what she said. The eyewitnesses, there are only 2 eyewitnesses in this scenario. And the fact that you end up with 11 to 101 doesn't weigh the 101 necessarily as being correct. Maybe the person 2 person 2 got it wrong, but they're a really nice person and convinced 100 people. Let's say person 1 got it right, but they're a dirty, rotten scoundrel who nobody wanted to listen to. So you see, manuscripts have to be weighed, not counted. The fact of the matter is, most of the manuscripts that have survived, because things fall apart. I mean, look at some of my Bibles that I've taught with over the years. The spine has fallen off. Things fall apart, and so it only makes sense that the vast majority of manuscripts we have would be very late and medieval. They don't count as much, at least not scientifically. Now, we often, as Christians often bring in so-called ideas to trump evidence. I'm not convinced that that's really a very sound practice. I'm not convinced that that really demonstrates a greater interest in the truth, or whether it represents the human tendency to use our minds to avoid the obvious. But from a logical standpoint, the older manuscripts would be weighed more heavily than the majority of medieval manuscripts that pretty much all say the same thing. So I wanted to slip that in here, that manuscripts should be weighed, not counted. Okay, well, let me keep going. In terms of the New Testament, the oldest manuscripts tend to be either papyri, which is a certain kind of document paper made out of reeds from a plant and laid crosswise at each other and somewhat glued together. Those are in scroll form. They tend to be the oldest. So that papyrus I was mentioning, early collection of almost all Paul's writings that date from about AD 200. It's a papyrus manuscript. From the 300s on, most of the manuscripts are written on animal hide or vellum, and they're in an uncial, what we call uncial manuscripts, that have all capital letters. Of course, the papyri have all capital letters too. They're written in a continuous script. That is, there's no spaces for words, between words, or no punctuation. There's a website, if you're taking this as a course, there's a website in the document for this week that will give you some sense of how that continuous script worked. Uncial manuscripts tend to date from the 300s and 400s and 500s and so forth. You also have what are called minuscule manuscripts that are the medieval ones. They're in cursive, a kind of lowercase cursive. Most manuscripts, therefore, are minuscules. They have abbreviations. There's a whole, you can take whole courses in these things. You can get a doctorate in these things. There's learning that will never end. Of course, there were early translations into other languages. Some of these are older than the Greek manuscript. So just because you're looking at a Latin manuscript from 300, you might have a better witness to the original reading than a Greek manuscript from 600. And of course, the Church Fathers quote the New Testament, and so even though there are no very old Greek manuscripts that have the ending of Mark, there is a quotation that seems to be this material from the late 100s in a church father named Irenaeus. Now, of course, you have to do textual criticism on the translations, on the church fathers. It's a very complicated thing, and of course, we should be very glad that somebody is interested in doing this hard work. But most of us don't realize how much work went into this. So that's external evidence, the kind of lay of the manuscripts. In general, If I see a papyrus or an uncial manuscript that has a certain reading, I give that more weight than a minuscule medieval manuscript. Okay, internal evidence. The basic rule is here. Pick the one as most likely to be original that best would explain how the other variations came about. And there are two basic rules here. Neither of them are absolute, but the first one makes a lot of sense. Usually the more difficult reading is the more original. Copyists did not get their jollies from messing up the text. In general, they tried to clarify the text. So usually the more difficult reading is the more original reading. And then this one is not at all always the case, but a lot of times the shorter reading is more likely to be the more original. That is, as people copied the text, they tend to expand the text to clarify it than cut things out. The tendency, this is not at all always the case, but the tendency is to expand the text, not to prune back the text. In fact, there's a manuscript of Acts. I forget how much longer it is than most manuscripts of Acts. It's a Western, so-called Western manuscript of Acts that is significantly longer. But it's not that it's not doctrine. They're not writing extra thoughts on Christ. It's more like go 3 blocks north to get to Troas. I mean, it's directional kind of clarificational things, and so again, this has been shown not at all to always be the case, but usually the shorter reading, if you have to, if you're at a line call and you have to make a judgment, usually the shorter reading is more likely to be original. Now, I do want to end this by talking about the other philosophy. There are very intelligent people who know more than I do about textual criticism who would maintain that manuscripts should be counted and not weighed. The majority text is not exactly the same as the Textus Receptus, which was based on Erasmus's text. Erasmus didn't have the majority of texts in front of him. Erasmus, so there are some potential peculiarities in Erasmus's text that majority text scholars would accept. The majority text is pretty straightforward. You basically add up the manuscripts. We have thousands and thousands of manuscripts. Well, what do most of them read? So it's very, very much like what the King James text is, but not exactly the same. There seems to be an assumption here. God would have preserved the original reading over time. At first glance, this sounds very convincing, especially because we seem to have some knee-jerk assumption that older is better. And so, especially as Protestants, get back to the Bible, get back to the original reading, down with tradition, that sort of thing. And so this sense that God would have let the text develop or expand or change over time, even though we're only talking about a small portion of the text, there is this kind of intuitive sense that, God would not have let the ending of Mark be added. Rather, it needs to be modern fiends taking it out. And you'll have to make up your own mind on this. I personally don't think that this philosophy, again, this is, in my opinion, this is us using ideas to try to avoid the most likely conclusions. In my mind, this is not a viewpoint that is really ultimately interested in truth. It is a viewpoint that basically says, I'm going to use my intellect to find a way to support the things I already think. Ironically, it is a kind of thinking that is used to preserve tradition rather than has an open mind toward what is really true. Again, you feel free to disagree with me. But here's why I have problems with this. For one, if this degree of precision with regard to the original wording, if this is really God's goal, then we should not even be using the Bible in English. I mean, this is what the Muslims do. The Muslims would say that if the Quran is not in Arabic, it's not the Quran. And so if we have to have that degree of precision, then let's just stop using any translation at all and use the Greek text, because any translation is going to, vary from the original text. So I don't think that actually this bears out. And a lot of the stories you hear about the precision in copying are actually more in relation to the Masoretes in the 900s than the time of Christ or the time of the Dead Sea Scrolls. The evidence we have of ancient manuscripts is actually that there was a sense of freedom. And this is borne out in the New Testament. This is, I think, the clincher. If you compare, for example, the way Hebrews 10:5 reads, "A body you've prepared for me," with the verse it's quoting in the Old Testament, "My ears you have dug out," you'll see that there is a textual issue even within the King James, where the verse Hebrews quotes is worded differently than in the Old Testament than it is in the New Testament. Well, there's no way around it. One of these is more original than the other, and they cannot both be equally original. So within the biblical text itself, we see that God did not preserve the original wording, and this would be shown time and time again in the New Testament. The New Testament authors did not necessarily use the original wording of the text, or actually what you find more often is that there was a freedom that the New Testament authors had to paraphrase and even to combine scriptures together. For example, in Matthew chapter 2, where it says Jesus' parents went to Nazareth that it might be fulfilled that which was spoken by the prophets, plural, he will be called a Nazarene. Well, you won't find an Old Testament text that says the Messiah will be called a Nazarene. You'll find a comment about Samson being a Nazarite. That's not a Nazarene. You find the word Nazar used in Isaiah of a text that was taken messianically about a Nazar that will come from Jesse. But there's a great deal of freedom in this sense that these Old Testament texts might somehow triangulate to spiritually hint that Jesus would be from Nazareth. Basically, the New Testament simply does not show a rigidity or a kind of arcane interest in getting back to the original text of the Old Testament. Rather, it shows a freedom in the Spirit to paraphrase, to combine, even to alter the wording of the Old Testament. So in the end, as noble as it sounds, as spiritual as it sounds to say that God would not have allowed the text to vary any, it just does not seem to hold up against the situation as it appears, which of course fits with my theology, which is that God is interested in the big picture, that this kind of pedantic concern for the details that can often lead to a kind of literalist fundamentalism, like the Pharisees are portrayed in, say, Matthew, or that Paul's opponents that he attacks in Galatians. That kind of rigidity down to the letter is not, in my opinion, ultimately the spirit of the New Testament itself, ironically, although it does seem to be a tendency of human nature, as we see time and time again in history. Well, you are welcome to evaluate the things that we've said. In fact, I hope you will. Thank you very much, and God bless.